Just a couple of years back, you could stretch the definition of gaming GPU pretty far. AMD's first generation of GCN cards, dating back as far as late 2011, had enough compatibility and performance to keep up with the latest games for the better part of a decade. The last couple of years, however, have seen developers put the squeeze on older hardware. VRAM requirements are starting to creep up, old cards are losing driver support, and gamers on a budget are starting to become painfully aware that DX12 compatibility and DX12 feature support are not the same thing. With all that in mind, I've decided to look at one of the cards I'd consider to be the bare minimum for gaming in the modern era. Working out which older AMD graphics cards still work in the latest games can be confusing. In the past, new graphics cards with increased model numbers often didn't indicate a change in the actual GPU on the card. This results in a situation where the R7 260X featured today can run almost everything, in theory, whereas a newer, more powerful R9 370 can't. Games such as Elden Ring requires GPUs that have at least the DX 12.0 feature level, which in the AMD lineup means GCN 2 or newer. Focusing on this architecture means the lowest end compatible cards are the Bon Air family, of which the R7 260X is probably the most powerful, being a higher clocked version of the original HD 7790 with an additional gigabyte of GDDR5 VRAM. Although 4GB would be even more suitable for today's memory-hungry games, only a couple of cards based on Bon Air seem to have that much on board, and they're both FirePro workstation cards, have fewer shaders and are slightly underclocked compared to their consumer-grade siblings. They also command substantially higher prices than the R7 260X, which is why you're watching a video about this card and not a FirePro W5100 right now. This memory limit means I've had to make a substitution from my starting lineup. Sadly, Guardians of the Galaxy requires 4GB of VRAM, refusing to start on 2GB or even 3GB cards. This means I've had to call up Elden Ring to fill its position on the roster. I know there's probably not the biggest crossover between fans of light-hearted Marvel adventures and dark, brooding fantasy epics, but I have to work with what I've got. The test system is my moderately priced gaming PC. For whatever reason, I couldn't get into the BIOS with this card installed, so I didn't test the simulated quad-core setup, but I don't think results will vary too much. Also, as is usual for my GCN card testing, I'm using the modded drivers from a Zone, in this case 22.6.1. You will probably find results differ if you use the official AMD drivers, especially in Halo Infinite. God of War is going to set the tone for this video, and I'm afraid that means there's going to be a lot of reduced quality settings and resolution scaling to get things even vaguely playable. Straight up 1080 low is a bad time, not even managing a cinematic 24 FPS. 30 FPS in regular gameplay isn't out of the question though, and the two ways I found were either through 80% render scaling or FSR balanced. As the FSR version used in God of War is the latest one, image quality is still pretty high, but in either case, frames can drop in cutscenes, and the lack of VRAM and the fact that the game doesn't seem to like AMD cards all that much means you'll probably encounter slowdowns on a regular basis. Final Fantasy VII Remake very kindly does all the work for you in terms of render scaling. In fact, you can't even turn it off. 1080 low made for a 35 FPS average with occasional dips below 30. I did try a pass with a 30 FPS frame limiter, but it didn't improve smoothness at all, and also didn't do much for the dynamic resolution scaling. The game still looks remarkably fine and plays smoothly enough for an RPG. As I mentioned in the intro, Guardians of the Galaxy doesn't recognise sub 4GB cards, and I'm actually considering dropping it from my videos altogether. Elden Ring is one of the best and most popular AAA games of the year, and despite its 60 FPS cap, it's proving to be easier to consistently benchmark. It doesn't always tolerate low-end GPUs very well, but in this case I managed to see a playable 34.5 FPS at 720 low, and without any vanishing character models as I've seen elsewhere. I attempted a run at 1600 by 900 and saw a 26 FPS average, which for a game so reliant on timing and fast reactions is probably too low. Forza Horizon 5's built-in benchmark is a great indication of performance if you're always losing races. The computer's driver seems allergic to overtaking, so there's always a ton of cars on screen. Hence, the R7 260X scores an average at 1080 medium of a little under 30 FPS, with FSR quality taking that up to 33. If you're content to just drive across the open world and not actually race, you can actually see FPS in the 40s and 50s most of the time. In races, it is possible to see FPS in the 30s and 40s, but only if you win. Perhaps this is an incentive to get good? I was actually a bit shocked that Halo Infinite even started, as I had no such luck with the 3GB R9 280 or HD 7970. Nevertheless, despite a warning that no compatible card was detected, I just clicked continue and the game proceeded to boot. It wasn't a great experience, truth be told. It's clear that 343 designed the game around current architectures. However, with the 30 FPS minimum frame rate enabled, the game can actually keep reasonably close to that limit. In an open world section of the campaign, I saw 30 FPS on average with lows of 25. From experience, I'd expect similar or worse results in big team multiplayer, but rather than punish myself with a half hour of painful frame rates and death, I decided to opt for capture the flag instead. With smaller levels and less geometry to process, the 260X saw averages up to 34, but lows still dip into the mid-20s. The other downside is that I saw a lot of the heavy-handed geometry culling that I first noted in the RX 6500 XT review, with low-quality assets loading up even close to the player, and my character's hand disappearing in multiplayer. So, perhaps a tolerable experience, but not a particularly good one. Cyberpunk at 1080 low is a no-go for the R7 260X. As I've observed in the past, the game drops traffic and pedestrian counts automatically on low-end hardware, but even so, it's scraping into the low 20s and stuttering like crazy. Thankfully, there are two options for resolution scaling beyond simply dropping the native res. FSR can deliver a suitably playable 32 FPS at its quality setting with just a hint of softness. The second option requires a tiny bit of effort on your part, but using the unofficial FSR 2 patch, available from Nexus mods, gives better looking results. At its performance setting, it delivers about the same frame rate as FSR 1 at quality, and both settings mean for larger numbers of cars and pedestrians, but the modded FSR 2 does create a ghost behind the car when driving. Still, I'd recommend it over version 1, and I look at it more in depth in a video linked below or at the end of this one. Rainbow Six Extraction is another game that doesn't suffer 2GB cards lightly. Even at the lowest settings, it was warning me I didn't have enough VRAM. Still, the benchmark ran smoothly enough, though there had to be a lot of sacrifices made to image quality. Using the ultra-low preset and 25% scaling, I saw an average of 74 FPS and 54 1% lows. And 25% scaling might seem like an incredibly low number, but Ubisoft express resolution scaling differently from other companies, and 25% in this game is about what others call 50%. Maybe I went and spoiled myself by doing a bunch of testing at a near-locked 360 FPS recently, but playing Splitgate at 60 FPS gave me whiplash. I'm not exaggerating when I say 66 FPS on average, with 1% lows of 48, is actually a pretty poor experience in this game, so I think I'm going to have to recommend 260X owners drop quality settings from Epic. Shocking, I know. But sacrifices have to be made. At 1080 low, averages are closer to 90 FPS, and lows break just over 60. And this makes for a pretty big improvement, though if it's still not enough, you could maybe get away with dropping resolution a little too. I don't think Vanguard liked this graphics card. It took one look at the 2GB frame buffer and started sulking, only loading the lowest possible quality versions of assets and textures. At 1080 with the lowest possible settings, there was something approaching the idea of a playable frame rate. 1% lows didn't drop below 30 and averages were in the middle 40s, but that's still less than ideal for a competitive shooter. Adding FSR balance gets close to the 60 FPS mark on average, but image quality takes even more of a hit and makes the game a good deal harder to play. At 1080 competitive settings, Fortnite actually did okay, I guess. I've seen similar results out of the much more power-hungry R9 280, averaging in the 70s, and with the typically low lows one has come to expect from the biggest game in the world. I guess it would be naive to expect such a hugely profitable game to have people working to actively improve it. Silly me. Apex Legends was a surprisingly good showing for the R7 260X. I actually didn't need to use resolution scaling to get close to 60 FPS, which is ideal for a game in which you'll spend quite a lot of time peeping at pixels. 1% lows were just short of high 30s, so it wasn't a flawless experience, but I can honestly say I've had worse. Finally, playing Call of Duty Warzone on the R7 260X isn't a great experience. That's it, that was the end of the sentence. FPS here was similar to in Vanguard, averaging 45 with a minimum of 34. Dropping the resolution scale helps get over 60 FPS, but without any cool scaling tech, it looks pretty mushy and just ends up being more challenging to play than it really needs to be. The R7 260X ticks the boxes for modern API compatibility, and thanks to Nimes, it's actively receiving driver updates, but that's about all I can say to recommend it. Unlike, say, the GTX 750 Ti or 950, it's actually pretty thirsty, requiring a 6-pin power connector to get going. I got mine for about 35 quid, and that doesn't seem to have been an unusually good deal. You can probably pick up this or similar Bonaire cards for about the same price quite easily. Should you? That depends. I'm more inclined towards the Nvidia Quadro M2000, which performs about the same or slightly better, with much more VRAM and lower power requirements, and is still being updated with official new drivers, at least at the time of recording. But that card does tend to cost more. If you can find an RX 460 or 560 for only a little more money, it's probably worth it for the modern architecture alone. If, however, this is absolutely as high as you can justify going, the R7 260X can in fact play games in 2022. Just steer clear of the 1GB versions, for your own sake. Thanks for watching, kindly do the usual YouTube things, if you feel so inclined, and I'll see you next time.